Father in heaven, we thank you as, again, it's a privilege to come and to learn. We think of the glory and the future that you have for us as your kids, certainly far more than we deserve. But we thank you that you've revealed these things to us in order to give us a glimpse. We acknowledge it's not an exhaustive explanation or plan of the future, but again, there's these hints and these glimpses around enough, for sure, to get us excited about what how you're going to use us in the future. And so we just pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. So, okay, page 4. We were talking about the team notes. If you
Which
don't have
4? Last week's 4? Or
last week's 4.
I think I...
Here's some, you can share those around.
Get your hands back here.
Yes.
I'll find out.
The only page 4 you should have
I am. Give me a second.
at the top. So,
You have a couple extras there?
what we've been talking about,
He's not
and
sharing.
remember,
Thank you.
this is a second or third level doctrine, right? So hopefully nobody's getting mad. Hopefully nobody's throwing around the heresy word. I imagine this is new for a lot of people. And
Extra one here.
the question is, well, I've never heard this before. Okay, well then, unless you are omniscient, unless you're omniscient, the fact that you've never heard it before, what does that even mean? Is that some sort of standard? Well, if I have never heard it before, it simply can't be true. So, again, unless you're omniscient, we all need to have a certain level of humility as we go through it, for sure. I think also I appreciate that a lot of people are bringing up different ideas and thoughts and comments, and it's helping me to articulate things a little bit clearer in the sense of some of the questions and comments, but I don't want to get bogged down into so many of the details. It's interesting that I've enjoyed some of the things because some of you know this, but I started a PhD program a few weeks ago, and even though there's a lot written on this, I'm leaning towards having this being part of my dissertation. And so as things come up, I'm like, I go and I do some research, I'm like, hey, okay. So I've been getting into some of this where I see some gaps that can be filled. My ultimate goal is to get to John 10, where Jesus makes a quote of Psalm 82, which we're going to get there eventually. So I also want to say that some of you have asked questions, and I'll say, I'm going to get that, I will answer you. And let me tell you what I don't mean. I don't necessarily mean that I'm going to answer you today. Okay? So you might think, oh, well, you didn't answer my question. Well, the reason why is because some questions have come up about certain things, and I'm going to spend a whole session on that question. So, whether it's, again, we get into Deuteronomy 32 or Psalm, some of you read the book, Psalm 82 and other passages, especially get some New Testament. I promise you, we will get there, and we will do it thoroughly. Okay? We will do it thoroughly, and but I don't want to give you a 2-minute answer when I could give you a 60-minute answer, okay?
Dissertation.
Which will be a little bit more appropriate, I think, because I imagine that most of you don't want a 2-minute answer. Well, some of you do. My wife's that way. She'll tell me, give me a 2-minute answer.
Cut to the chase.
Cut to the chase.
Short, sweet, to the point.
So that's sure. So maybe some of you might want that, but I'd rather be thorough so that you can go back and look it up. So what we've been doing is this has still been up here from last week, which is great. And remember, we are only talking about the Old Testament right now. We're going to get to the New Testament later. And we're going to get to the beings, these other spiritual beings, who they are. But it's super important that we don't take the New Testament language, which is Greek, and force it back on Old Testament, which is Hebrew. Now, to me, that doesn't create a conflict of inspiration, because they're both inspired. But we also, as we're learning and growing in our understanding of hermeneutics, or how to interpret the Bible, there isn't a contradiction. I'm not saying that at all. But the New Testament writers, they're speaking in ways that are more general. They're just lumping it's like any being that you have is lumped into the angel category. Well, that's not the way it is in the Old Testament. So, again, I don't mind being accused of precision. Okay? So that's what we're after, is we are going to be very precise. What's the word pedantic? That's a good word. Pedantic.
How do you spell it?
Pedantic. Anybody?
Too much information just kind of goes on. Something like that.
Somebody who's pedantic is overly obsessed with the minutiae of the
Yeah.
details, okay? So, I'm going to be that person, okay? In order for you to
Yes,
say,
you
well,
will.
he's pedantic, but at least he's thorough, okay?
Out of character.
Maybe, whatever. So, what we've been doing is talking about the difficulty of putting these beings on a hierarchy. Even scholars in the Old Testament world that study this all the time, they recognize, wow, this is kind of hard. Now, I will say this, that remember the Old Testament was not written in a vacuum, it's written in the Near East. So there's a lot of other literature that is out there that help explain or help magnify or whatever the various religious viewpoints. You have Mesopotamia, right? Sumeria. You have Egypt, all their pantheon of gods. You have the Levant, or what's basically Israel, Syria, Lebanon, that whole area is called the Levant. And so you have literature that's old, 3,000 years ago, or more, even more if you go get into Egypt. They have all their viewpoints. So, now remember, and this is, I cannot say this enough, that we've said this before, and it's worth mentioning again, all right? Okay, creation, all right, then we have, let's go here, I'm going to say 1446, which is the Exodus, all right, BC, okay, and then creation's back here, let's say it's 5000 BC, all right, just for fun. Okay, Genesis 1 and 2, Genesis 3 through, let's say 11, and then Genesis 12 all the way to the book of Exodus, let's say chapter 24. When Moses is writing this, he's writing this a long time after the creation of the world. So, we said this before, when Moses, he's writing this to the Israelites, and he's saying, hey, you guys know about Egypt. You guys know about Mesopotamia. You guys know about Anatolia. All these other empires. They've heard all the stories. We talked about all the flood stories. So he's saying, hey, all this, scholars will call this Genesis 1 through 11, they'll call it primeval history. Okay? That's just the word they use. When Moses is writing this way, way later, you have all of these theologies existing. And Moses is coming along and saying, I'm going to tell you the truth. Okay, that's super important. He's writing way, way later. Now, if Moses is writing in order to provide the truth of this primeval history, which the Egyptians have their version, the Mesopotamians have their version, do you think that he is going to write with a purpose? I mean, when people write books, God forbid, they write with a purpose. They also write with an apologetic, right? We talk about apologetics. What does that mean?
Defense.
Argument
Defense.
to defend.
An apologist is not someone that says, I'm sorry. An apologist is someone who writes specifically to defend what we would say truth. So Moses is the first apologist. He's writing to tell everybody, primarily the Israelites, but as the word goes out, as the book of Genesis goes out, he's writing to say, you guys have little bits and pieces, just like you have 150 different cultures around the world have flood stories. You guys have different things. Sometimes people lasted during the flood, they survived it. He goes, I'm going to tell you the truth. So when he writes this down, he's writing in this context. Sometimes he uses language that is identical to what you would find in a city called Ugarit. Okay, we'll see that later, especially when we get over here to Psalm 82. Psalm 82 verse 1 as an example, you can find it exact quote from some of the literature in the city of Ugarit. So the guy who's writing Psalm 82, later, 1000 BC, what's his context? His context is Ugarit. So when he's writing and telling the truth, he is borrowing, whether he's borrowing the language or not, I don't know the motive of the guy who wrote it. Okay? All we know is that the language he's using is identical to what we find here, already existing. Which does that bother us?
I quote things all the time to make my point.
To make, yes.
That I didn't come up with. Yeah.
Ugarit was way back, let's say 1200, which is a little bit earlier, let's say 1400 BC. He's writing 400 years later, but everybody in town knows Ugarit language. So when he's writing Psalm 82, and he uses that language to make a theological point, is it wrong for us to understand Ugarit? Nothing is written in a vacuum. So what happens is when we come to Psalm 82, eventually, people want to take this, lift it out, throw it into a New Testament context, which now is 1100 years later, and say, this is how we should interpret it. I say, no. Sorry, no. That's not the way it works. We have to understand that, you can get there, but you're going to end up being all over the place, and you're going to end up bringing in your own theology, and even New Testament theology, which New Testament theology was written in a specific time frame, with all of this understood, but Psalm 82 was not written in a Greco-Roman context.
The downside of this from enemies of God, God haters, in this day and age are saying that, oh, there's nothing original about Christianity or Judaism. They turn it around because they understand that some things are quotes from other writings in the ancient times. So they turn it on its head and say this is a reason that it isn't true. Yeah, exactly. So that's the downside of... But they're not, they're being so disingenuous with that argument. It doesn't make sense.
Let's say another thing. If you go to Egypt and you study Egyptian theology, lo and behold, you have a guy that died and was raised again 3 days later. That existed way back in 3000 BC. Well, then Christianity comes along. This is 1100 years later, but let's make it just for fun, 30 AD. As Bob said, you Christians, come on, can't you come up with something original? That idea of a guy dying and being raised from the dead, go back to the Osiris myth in Egyptian thinking. That's been around for 3,000 years.
Yeah, but
that's the best you got?
He was cut up in 13 pieces. Isis only found 12, and he's resurrected in the underworld. So you have to go to the details and say, no, it's not the same.
But even if it was identical, okay, there isn't the myth is there. And when scholars use the term myth, see, we look at it in our English language when this is literary word. The word myth, we think of a myth as something false, right? It's a myth. That's in literary terms, scholars, they don't talk like that. C.S. Lewis talks about the myth of Christianity. What? The myth of Christianity? Doesn't he believe that it's true? He goes, oh, hold on a minute. We're not speaking the same language. When we talk about myth, we talk about the story. Okay? So
even story today has a falseness to it, which has been interesting because people say, "Oh, tell me a story." All right.
Tell me a story. Entertain me. And so oftentimes you'll hear me try to be precise. I'll say in the narrative of 1 Kings, in the narrative of Samuel, I'm using that because if I say, I'm so used to writing papers, right? So if when you think that way, in the story of Samuel, that story, that false story, because David and Solomon certainly didn't exist. That's the world that in Old Testament archaeology, 99% of the scholars, do they believe that David was a king? Absolutely not. That's a great story. It's a great myth. Solomon, again, nice story that you have there. And so when we have to think in terms of not only what we're describing, but we got to remember that things are in their context. And so when the Bible comes along and talks about Jesus dying and rising again, The question is did we just lift some story from Egyptian mythology or Egyptian religion? No. But as Bob said, people will accuse Christianity of being unoriginal. But because, oh yeah, you guys in your Bible, you have a lot of the flood stories. Yeah, we have flood stories in Sumer, we have flood stories in Assyria, big deal. But when Genesis comes along here, Moses is saying, oh, you guys have heard the stories about how these how these supernatural Elohim came down and mated with human women in Genesis 6? You guys have heard about that? I'm going to tell you the true version. This story of gods coming down, you see it in the Greek pantheon, right? Demigods, and Zeus comes down and mates with it, and then they produce these other things. Again, Christianity, come on, can't you come up with something original? We have that in the Greek gods. We have that in Sumeria. But what Moses is saying is, hey, it happened. But I'm going to tell you the real version. So it's not a coincidence that the stories appear all the way through history in all these other places, but we have the original version. And when we get to Genesis 6 eventually, I'm going to show you there's various viewpoints of interpreting Genesis 6, and people, they try to demythologize is the word they use. They take out the supernatural element of the Bible and say, this wasn't really, supernatural beings coming down on women. They were rulers, or they were the line of Seth, and they totally take out anything supernatural. I don't know if that makes them feel better, if it's not as scary. I'm not sure what their motives are, but the fact of the matter is, if you look at all of history, this is there. Now that doesn't mean it's true, but when it appears in Genesis 6 and Moses is saying, let me give you the real version, I go, I'm going to read it in its context. So all that being said, when we come to all of this, we are going to look at it in its context. Now, here's the thing, just so that I can be clear. When we get to Psalm 82, and we recognize that there's an Ugaritic parallel that preceded Psalm 82 being written. And I come down and I say, hey, Psalm 82 verse 1, God is standing in the Elohim, I'll say it that way. Elohim is standing in the congregation of El. Because that's Adat El is what it says in Hebrew. The word Adat El, or that phrase, appears in Ugaritic language crystal clear. I mean, identical. Well, if I come in here and I walk away and say, well, hey, I think this is speaking of God standing, Elohim, Yahweh, is standing in the midst of these other Elohim, these other supernatural beings. Oh, Mondo, now you're using Ugaritic language to interpret the Bible. You're forcing this on there. That's not what I'm doing. I'm not interpreting the Bible by pagan literature, okay? What I'm simply doing is recognizing that the writer is speaking in a context where everybody would have known that language. And he's saying, I'm going to give you the true version. We're not taking this pagan stuff and forcing it on the Bible as if this has no connection. Okay? So those are just some clarifications.
Just real quick, a little background there. Pre-30 AD, Ugaritic, the pagan writings as they were, Mesopotamian, Sumerian, and all that. Where did they come from? Were they seen firsthand? Were they inspired? Were they legend stories that just...
At least stories, oral legend, like the flood. The flood, the idea of a flood appears in 150 different cultures around the world. And most of it is orally written, or orally transferred. It's really rare to have things written, to find them. It's rare in ancient times.
For myself, who's ignorant in all this. And then we see Moses collecting that, as it were. But
Not necessarily.
Let me tell you the
Go ahead.
truth.
Okay, yeah.
And
I want to make a clarification.
let me tell you the truth, bringing that together as. So wasn't there an insight prior as to the goings-on, as to what God was doing? Doesn't it fold into the gods having their nations? And
Yeah. See, remember that if we, like, get rid of some of this for a minute.
I didn't mean to distract you.
No, this is helpful
But there's
because
some education that's needed
So,
here for us that are.
here's Genesis 12. What do we know? We know Abraham was alive, right? Okay. So Abraham was alive, let's just say 2100 BC. He's quite a few centuries from Moses. Well, what did Abraham? Abraham was from Mesopotamia. There's no doubt he understood. And again, people talk. He was familiar with all those histories. We don't know what he told Isaac. We don't know what he told Jacob. We know that he was an idol worshiper. Him and his family. Joshua 24 says that exact thing. Hey, you guys were worshiping other gods on the other side of the river. So we can't answer the question of what Abraham himself believed, but what we can answer clearly, based on archaeological evidence, is the environment, the social, religious, even political environment that Abraham lived. No doubt. The writings from, these cuneiform writings that appear all over, they're very, very helpful. And what's fascinating is later, if you come over here, you see several of the cuneiform writings of really, I would say, Assyria and Babylon, and they reference the kings of Israel. And we see it and you go, hey, this mentions Jehu by name, which is really fascinating to help us understand that, again, the Bible was written in this context, and these guys are talking about how they humbled Israel in various things. And there's this cuneiform. It makes reference to this guy of the house of Omri, etc., etc., etc. It's really fast. And not only up in Assyria, you see it down across the river in modern-day Jordan. You can look at what's called the Mesha Stele. They reference a specific king. It's so. We don't know what Abraham told his kids. All we know is Moses came later and said, I'm going to tell you the true version. Now, one other thing. Aunt Rose asked the question, where did Moses get his information?
There we go.
We know from Genesis 5 verse 1, you see the word book. And that was the book, it's interesting, this is the book of Adam. Does that mean Adam had a book? Or is it just, it's a book of the genealogy of Adam? So did it pass down through Noah, through the flood, and it went down to Abraham all the way through, and then finally somebody handed it to Moses? I don't know.
Jethro, as a priest.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Moses married his daughter. What is known about him and what he believed and what he taught? Because he obviously gave advice to Moses about how to set up
An organization?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And he was raised in the Egyptian culture
Oh, no.
as an Egyptian king.
For 40 years.
So
as a
that
prince.
was, and he was probably highly educated in those.
Yep.
On those.
And we know about Midian. He was a priest of Midian, but exactly what the religious theology of Midian was, if you look at the Archaeological Study Bible, see in Exodus 18 about Jethro. What exactly, they were Midian was kind of down in the Sinai, more in the eastern side of the Gulf of Aqaba. So what did he learn there? The Bible doesn't tell us exactly.
Didn't it say that Moses talked face to face with God?
Later, yeah. So remember, he talked face to face really in Exodus. Well, Exodus, the whole book of Exodus, really, from chapter 4 on, especially when we get to 24. But prior to that, he lived 40 years being trained in Egyptian thinking, Egyptian mythology, or Egyptian stories, their pantheon. Then he goes and spends 40 years out in the desert with Jethro, who was a priest of Midian. What did he learn there? We don't know exactly. But what we do know is when he came, he wrote down stuff in a book as he was writing it as it happened. That's super important too. And we could get there, that's a whole other argument, but
Moses was emptied for 40 years out in the desert. He was emptied.
yeah. Got a wife, couple kids.
Everything that
that's-
he brought with him from Egypt was gone.
That's my old life.
Right.
But there's no doubt he was skilled. He could write. Because a lot of people say, well, this idea that people are writing in 1400, come on, give me a break. And you go, well, have you not looked at any of the Egyptian hieroglyphs?
Yeah.
Stuff like that. So,
Doesn't it stand to reason he was just getting educated in all this matter of fact, I mean, look at the Egyptians. They were well known
Oh, they're
to carry the world literature
Yeah.
in their
Just-
their culture. So
you
not
can't
to
go
mention-
down and
not to mention with Jethro. Can you imagine what he laid on them about their past, where
Yep.
they come from, all of that?
So,
that was interesting.
what we know is he brings this group of Israelites out. And they have had a really interesting history of thinking. Right? They've been just entrenched in the land of all this stuff. The religion, the history, and Moses comes and says, okay guys, let me tell you where you came from the start. Adam, down, and again, he's very selective in his writing. He's not just writing everything down. He said, well, I'm going to give you the generation from Adam to Noah, and then once we get past that, I'm going to give you Seth, and then down all the way to when we get to Abraham, and then Abraham's family, and then he gives us a little bit about Isaac and Ishmael, and then talks about Ishmael's kids, and then he talks about Lot, and Lot's kids, Edom, going out there. So he gives us little snippets. Now, if he includes it, is it important? In his purpose.
Yes.
Remember, he has an overarching purpose in his writing, and he's saying, well, I'm including this genealogy in order for you to understand what I'm writing. It's not just haphazard. Oh, I write this guy's name down. I mean, there's millions of people. But if it's in there, there's a reason. Okay? So, now, that's kind of a good introduction. All right? A reminder of where we're at and where we're going. And as we talk about some of these things later, when we get to Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 82, we are going to read them in their context. We're not going to bring the New Testament and force it back on this at all. That would be, again, we're talking ultimately about hermeneutics. How do we interpret the Bible to get at a most reasonable and I think right interpretation of things? What we did last time was we're talking about the nature, the function, and the hierarchy or the status of these Elohim beings. So, one of the things that we discussed, and Bill and I were talking about this, and I want to bring it up again because I think it was a good thought. All right, here's the question that I have for you: is if you look on your sheet there, page 4, we saw the nature of these beings. They're spiritual beings. That's the Hebrew ruach. We saw that these are spiritual beings. These are spiritual beings that have the ability to enter into our physical world. Right? We see that. Genesis 19 is an example. 2 angels show up to rescue Lot, and they appear as men. They have earlobes, they have noses, they have hands, they grab him, so they eat. Okay? So they certainly can appear. There's no doubt, we'll get to more of that later. We also talked about, in number 2, that these guys are in the heavens. No surprise. Satan is the prince of the power of the air. So this word heavenly appears over and over and over, and it's a description of their otherworldliness. The fact that they live in this spiritual realm that is different than us. And at Psalm 89, this is what came up. Psalm 89:5, they're under number 2. Let the heavens, or heavenly ones, you can take it that way, praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? So when we talk about Elohim, I'm going to fight this to the end, because Elohim, and I haven't even given you all the argumentation. Okay? Elohim does not mean human, ever. Okay? And again, talk to me during the week. My office is always open. I can explain and share with you why that is even more if you like. Do humans live in the heavens?
No.
No, we don't have some sort of experience up there. That's what the writer is trying to say. He's saying, hey, who in the heavens? Who's in the heavens? Who in the heavens is like the Lord? Who's in the heavens? Who among the Elohim is like Yahweh? These heavenly ones. Who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? What he's saying is, hey, these Elohim. I want to make sure I write this up here. This is the Elohim, and I'm going to put this here because we had humanity down here, which this is the physical world. Okay? So I'll just put physical. Alright. Who among the Elohim compares to the Lord? We've seen this language over and over. Well, where are they living? They're in the skies. who among the heavenly beings, literally there, sons of God is like the Lord? So, we're not there yet, but there's another, there's another name. Sons of God. So, who are those guys? We're going to talk about them. But the writer is saying, who among these Elohim that live in the sky, these sons of God, who is like Yahweh? A God, an Elohim, greatly be feared, in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above. Now, here's the question that Bill and I talked about. Okay. Is Satan still holy?
Oh,
I
Okay.
wouldn't think so.
No.
that's a trick
Good
question.
question. Bill, help us out. What do we say?
Well, plain and safe.
Depends on what your definition of holy is, and if it's being used as set apart, then he would still qualify.
Yep. See, we see holy as pure, right? You guys just made a mistake.
What makes him holy is where he dwells, isn't it? He doesn't
Well-
dwells in the third heaven. He only dwells
It's-
in the second
The
heaven.
word set apart.
Well, that's sanctification. Why isn't that he's sanctified? I mean, it's the same definition, right?
No,
No.
we think of set apart as only referring to something that's pure and holy. The word doesn't mean that. It can mean that. We have to say, what does it mean? So here's the second question. Has Satan lost his position?
Not yet.
Not yet. See, he's set apart in his office, which we're going to try to figure out what his office is. Okay? He still has his office. He hasn't been thrown out he hasn't been, let's rephrase it. There has been some throwing out, but he hasn't been imprisoned yet, all right?
Right.
Let's say that. That happens in Revelation 20. And even there, he's in prison for 1,000 years, then he's let out. God knows, we'll talk about it. But then he's put in his eventual destination is what? Lake of fire, right?
So you're telling us he's been impeached forever?
He certainly has been charged with a crime, but he hasn't been imprisoned yet in the lake of fire. Secondly, I'll bring it up now just to introduce it. What is the lake of fire also called? Do you guys remember?
Hell.
Gehenna.
Gehenna.
Yeah, but if there's,
Second
it's
death.
different.
Second death. Okay. Do humans become annihilated and cease to exist in their judgment?
No.
Right?
The experience is second
See,
death.
death for us, we think when we get to Psalm 82, this is going to come up again. Okay? Death is not ceasing to exist for men, for mankind, or for these supernatural beings. I keep trying to say angels here. I got to catch myself. So Satan, this being who has been set apart, who definitely is not pure, okay, but he still is set apart. He's still holy by the word, meaning set apart. His destiny is death, but it's the second death. It's not ceasing to exist. His death is exactly identical to who? All unbelievers, right?
Right.
Let's remember that. So when Psalm 82 verse 7 says to these Elohim, you are going to die like men, Satan gets the exact same destiny, the second death, as unbelievers do. Which is called, now, you've got to remember, that's a big deal. Because these Elohim were created to live forever. They were immortal.
So are we.
Well, I would agree. But we have this experience on earth of having the first death, which is what? Physical separation of our spirit from our body. That's all death means. If you do, it just means separation. It's interesting. The first death is separation of the body and the soul, and the second death is separation of the being from God.
When's the gnashing of the teeth and
That's
Lake of
that's
fire.
probably both.
both?
Yep, because if you look at Luke 19 as an example with the rich man, he's down there and he's in pain. He's looking for just a drop of water on his tongue. So he's obviously suffering immediately in the temporary holding cell. But eventually they're going to get thrown into the lake of fire.
Is that where purgatory came into being? Because there's always in this
No, purgatory came from the book of Maccabees, where you still had an opportunity of praying for people in that holding cell, but there's no doubt there's some symbolism. Okay, so when it says heavenly ones or holy ones here, remember that don't think of it in terms only as pure. These beings, Satan has not lost his position. He is still considered holy. He's not pure, set apart. He hasn't lost his position. He still is part of this group of Elohim that he has his own kingdom. We'll see all that, okay? Just remember.
Princes, the term princes in Psalm 82, like one of the princes. They're talking about holy ones, so that must be a title within the divine council, or is it not?
Well, I don't think so there because of the parallelism. Remember when we're interpreting things, we have to look in terms of genre, right? So poetry, psalm, he says they will die. It uses the word, the Hebrew preposition, like Adam and like princes. So if you look at the parallel, these guys are both, I think they're both human-oriented because of the parallelism. So even though the word prince can mean a variety of things, and the word prince does appear in Daniel 10, and that's the Hebrew in reference to what we'll talk about later. But I think looking at it within the genre, understanding parallelism, which is common through Hebrew, we know, or especially poetry, you will die like Adam and you will die like princes, or really Adam or mankind, if you want to say it that way. So that's where I would say that princes is not a reference to spiritual, anything more than just the human realm because of the parallelism.
What has he lost? Because he isn't the worship leader in heaven anymore, so he can't be the worship leader in heaven, can
Well, we'll get there.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
we'll get there maybe today. Even.
Okay.
So we're talking about their nature. We talked about stars. You know, this idea that stars are something that are beyond us, right? We know that. We can't reach out and grasp the stars. So the Bible uses this language for them. Number 4 there, this is the word kedoshim, this idea of holy ones. The assembly of the holy ones, the assembly of the set apart ones, the council, Psalm 89 verse 7. You see that? A God greatly feared, an Elohim greatly feared in the council of the set apart ones, and awesome above all those who are around him. Okay? This brings us back to this. You have these beings, these Elohim, that are up in the heavens, and there's Yahweh on his throne. But we do know that there's other thrones. Daniel 7. In the New Testament, we saw that at the end, we're going to be sitting on thrones, right? This isn't anything new. So you have Yahweh surrounded by some thrones. We don't know exactly who's on those thrones, but we do know that thrones, by definition, are rulers. Rulership. God doesn't need to have a divine council. He's invited this heavenly group to participate. We saw that in 1 Kings 22. Remember? God was going to bring judgment on one of the kings, Ahab, and said, hey, what should we do? And then a spirit steps forward and says, we'll do this. So God's inviting participation. Okay? So God has all these beings, but here the writer, they just can't help it. They can't help saying, oh, there you are, Lord. You're in the council of the set apart ones. Psalm number 4 there. Psalm 89:7. Awesome above everybody that's around you. Just so that we don't miss it. And you have all these Elohim, which are, for us, pretty incredible beings, right? Normally, if you see an Elohim show up in your room at night, you're going to be scared stiff. You're going to fall on the ground. You're going to fall on your face. And these guys are pretty amazing. But Yahweh, he's the one. I mean, nobody's in his class because he is the uncreated creator in that sense. Zechariah 14, the Lord is coming back, and all of his holy ones with him. Okay, so these are part of the nature, the set-apartness of these other beings. They're spiritual, they're heavenly, they're stars. These Elohim are set apart. Now, let's talk about function. What do they do? And I've given you some things here. That the word malach in Hebrew is the word angel. Okay? And really, it just means messenger. So, one of their functions is to be a messenger. And we saw, we said this last time, that anybody really can kind of be a messenger, but a messenger is kind of, if you look at some of not everybody is part of the divine council. Because in Daniel 7, as an example, you have the Lord on his throne. You have these other thrones that are there that are set up in the heavenly host. And then you have 10,000 times 10,000 attending him, serving him. So if we wanted to say that, I'm going to write down, I don't have it on your sheet, but I might maybe. You have these attendants. Okay? This is Daniel 7 as an example. You have attendants down here. This is part of their function. But they're not up here sitting on thrones. So now, hierarchy. Whoa, now we have Yahweh above. You have some people here that are on the thrones, and then you have these other guys that are down here attending. Or, I'm going to write the word angel or messenger. So these guys are messaging. Is that a word? Okay. Okay. Messaging. They have their function. Okay. Now, all these writings, context, right? Interestingly, if you look at Mesopotamia, Ugarit, Egypt, all the other things, they have their own hierarchies in their pantheons. In their pantheon, I'll show you this, which I say this only to show the similarity, which again, we're getting the truth. So in theirs, they have 1, 2, 3, 4. They actually have 4 levels of hierarchy. The first one is El, and this is in Ugarit, as an example. This is the word that appears. And Ugaritic is a Hebrew, it's a language, Hebrew and biblical Hebrew, Ugaritic and Phoenician. They're all called Semitic languages, Northwest Semitic languages to be very specific. And one of the classes I had to take one time was we did, it was called a Hebrew inscription class, but we had any inscriptions that were found, we had to translate them from the Ugaritic, the Phoenician, the Moabite, all these different things. And it was interesting how similar all these languages were to Hebrew. But the fascinating thing is, in that language, the guy at the top, his name is El. Oh, wow, that's interesting, because in Psalm 82, verse 1, it says the congregation of, in Hebrew, and this is what it says, El. Okay? Now, El just is the word in Hebrew that means God, but it actually became a name, which is fascinating to me. This is what you have existing prior to Psalm 82, but when Psalm 82 is written again, I think that they're saying, Nana, 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 you have your version, I'm going to give you the real version. And in our version, the biblical version, El is Yahweh. His name is Yahweh. So you have El, and then you have the second group are known as the sons of El. Okay? This is right now I'm talking about, if you want me to write it up here, pagan literature. Okay? I'm going to separate this out. This is Bible over here. All right? All we're trying to do is see this similarity. Sons of El, which specifically in Ugaritic, 70, which were called, translate it, sons of God. Uh-oh, now we're getting, these are buzzwords, okay? Well, then you had the third level in this literature were artisans, people that build things. These were the lesser beings, lesser gods, if you want to say it. Then you get down here to number 4, and you have the messengers, okay? Now what scholars will say is, well, if you go over to the Bible, you see number 1, you see 2, because we see sons of God. We don't really see 3 at all. That's not really represented there. But we do see 4, which is the angels, okay? So when you look at the hierarchy, what we're going to try to do, I'm going to need your guys' help, we're going to try to put these guys in the hierarchy based on the verses. But it's fascinating that the Bible presents this, the pagan literature presents this, and it's pretty similar. In fact, exact at times. Okay? We're not using this to interpret the Bible. We're just saying, when he's writing this, he's telling these guys, you guys have it wrong. Because one of the sons of El, as we know, is Baal. Baal was a storm god. How often do we have that in the Old Testament?
A lot.
Baal appears all over the Ugaritic literature. So when you read about Baal and the writers writing about Baal, what he's saying is, we know about your literature, and it's wrong, and Yahweh is better than Baal and El altogether. That's why the whole drama of 1 Kings 19 with Elijah. Hey, we know El's God, but Baal is the storm god. Let's have a little test for lightning. Let's see who's going to win this one. And they have the contest, and of course, as you know, they're out there. It's fascinating too. I'll give you a little nugget. In the 1 Kings passage, what were they doing? What were the prophets of Baal doing in trying to get Baal's attention?
Cutting themselves.
Cutting themselves. In some of their literature, of the Ugaritic literature, it says very clear, "Oh Baal, we worship you." This is what you see in the Canadian. "Oh Baal, we worship you. We cut ourselves in order to show our commitment to you." Well, that's in the pagan literature, and we see it in the Bible. So it's not some random, what are they doing, cutting themselves? Now we have a comparative literature section that says this was part of their rituals.
Is it like a blood sacrifice?
It was blood, it was everything, they would mark themselves. But it's to me, I think, the Bible is written into context, right? When they're writing this in 1 Kings 19, everybody's going, "Oh, well, we know what the Baal people do. They cut themselves," and it helps confirm the validity of that book being written in a specific time. That's why I say when the book was written, it's written in a specific context. Okay?
When Satan was cast out of heaven and his other fallen angels, couldn't they all have been areas of conquest where each one of them took over an area and developed their own languages and areas? So they wanted to be worshipped also as fallen beings. So they developed, these other countries and these other languages. And so since they were connected to the heavenly realm, they just kind of, let's say, corrupted it and
Some
brought it
things of
down.
what you said are true, and we're going to detail that out.
Okay.
Yep, just be patient. When we get to Deuteronomy 32, we're going to see how that all works and plays out.
We're at 106 for how that plays out, by the way.
Yeah.
So,
Okay? All right. So we have angel, which is messenger, and you can see, again, I'm writing these notes. These notes are not exhaustive, but I want you to be able to say, hey, I'm giving you the gist of it here, so don't ever hold me. I'm not writing another book here, okay? I'm just trying to give you the highlights. Number 2 there on the bottom of page 4, ministers. This is different than attendants. So ministers are those that do whatever God wants. Where do you think they would be?
Pop them above angels.
Let's put them down here. Okay? So now we have ministers. Or ministers, we have angel. So we're kind of filling in our hierarchy here. But these are all Elohim. Turn with me to page 5. The other question I have is, this is a sarcastic question. Did I include any scripture in these notes?
Yes.
Yeah.
As always.
Just so we're on the same page. There's a lot of scripture here. That's my goal. If I'm being accused of not giving scripture, I'm going to slap somebody. Okay? In a nice way. In the name of Jesus. Because I'm trying to, and this is only a sampling, okay? This is not exhaustive. The number 3 there on the top, which is this is a very interesting word. The word watcher. It only appears in the book of Daniel. It's an Aramaic word. The book of Daniel, as I put there on your sheet, from chapter 2, verse 4 to chapter 7:28, it's written in Aramaic. And then it switches. We're not getting into why. Okay? The word for watcher appears 3 times. Interestingly, the task of a watcher, this is a task, is connected directly with the sons of God description in the book of 1 Enoch. Okay? So, if all we had was, well, no, we don't just have that. So, you guys got this, okay? This is the divine council motif. appears in ancient literature, it also appears in the Bible, and we're trying to get the hierarchy. Now, in Daniel chapter 4, we have this word watcher, right? What does it say that the watcher did? This is important. They're watching, they're observing, okay? But I think I put it in there. He's labeled the Holy One, all right? But Daniel 4:17. What? So they're separated. I'm going to put separated one, all right? Just so that we, okay?
They rebelled.
I don't want you to think holy is pure only. This being, this being, whoever they are, he is, she is, and not a kid to she, but whoever, no sex in there. This being is watching. But what does the watcher do?
Administer.
Administers. What's your proof?
Because it says it in the text.
Right. But say that. I'm not disagreeing with you, but say it out loud for everybody. What's he doing?
It says it in the text.
Right? He's giving a decree.
Yeah.
Well, that's rulership, right? So, in verse, what is that, 24? 17? 17.
Daniel 4:17.
4:17, and then in verse 4:24, it says that this decree is the decree of Yahweh. So, the watcher decrees that Nebuchadnezzar go out and spend, 7 years growing long nails, growing long hair, eating like an animal,
Oh, yeah.
to humble him. But fascinating, this is a decree of the watchers, these separated ones. Now, we could probably guess that at least this particular watcher that put the decree is probably pure. All right? Because they're judging Nebuchadnezzar for his hubris, right? For, his arrogance. But what we do know is that this decree was also the decree of Yahweh. So these guys they're not renegades doing their own thing. But they are involved. So, where would we want to put the watcher over here?
Above ministers.
Pretty high.
Probably in the divine council, right? So this is the divine council line. So we're going to throw him in there because he's part of this ruling council. Because he's issuing decrees, which Yahweh says, yeah, I'm on board with that, which is consistent with 1 Kings 22. Go ahead.
Are you saying that there are no watchers that are evil?
No,
Okay.
I did not say that.
Okay, I don't want to
appreciate the
misinterpret it.
clarification because we're going to see later where I think some of these watchers, or if we're going to use the term sons of God, if, it's a big if, the book of Enoch is accurate. The book of Enoch is telling us that the watchers are connected with this other title, sons of God. Which that does appear, the sons of God appears several times in the Old Testament. We'll get to them in a minute. Okay? So, first Enoch, and in the first Enoch passage, the watchers are equated with the sons of God, specifically Genesis 6. Where Genesis 6, 1 through 4, where these Elohim, it specifically says the sons of God came down, took on women, and produced this hybrid, the Nephilim, these giants. Well, in Genesis 6 we have sons of God, but we don't have the term watcher. But first Enoch says that they're the same. Whether that's true or not, I'm trying to be biblical. I don't know. I'm just telling you to think about it. Okay? Doesn't matter if you do or don't. I can't say I believe it 100%. Simply to say that if it's true that watcher equals sons of God, those watchers are rebels. Those watchers are unpure. Okay? Or impure. Because they came down and they specifically disregard. Now, you want some homework? Okay, we're going to get to this. Look up 2 Peter 2 verse 4 and Jude 6. That's your homework if you want. And this idea of these supernatural beings coming down, I've heard people say, well again, we'll get to it, people say, there's no evidence for that being true. Read 2 Peter 2:4. Read Jude 6. And look at the context. We're going to get to that later. So words you want to look for are strange, flesh, well that's interesting, left their proper abode, And that's, we talked about that in the earlier parts of the notes, that their domain, those are words that somehow they went over. Secondly, this is fascinating. What's the context of both of these passages? False teachers. What? False teachers. Well, the only way you get to false teachers is by reading the book of Enoch. Because that doesn't appear.
Weren't they fallen sons of God?
Yes!
Okay, wouldn't that separate them from the sons of God then?
Well,
As both
if you
being
wanted to
both
say,
being evil?
if you wanted to say you have the pure and the impure,
Yeah, something like
sure,
that.
I know.
Okay.
That's no problem.
You have to consider though, they come from the same creator.
They're the same class. Okay? So, we have Watcher over here, part of the divine rulership. We also have the heavenly host, or the mighty ones. This is pretty interesting, too. We talk about the Lord of hosts, right? The Lord of hosts. You know, growing up Catholic, Bob, help me. What did that mean? The Lord of the wafer.
The wafer.
This was the host. I'm a young kid. I didn't know the Bible. I'm thinking, they keep talking about the Lord of the host. I have the host in my hand. Well, he's the Lord of that. It's not too amazing.
We get to eat it.
Yeah, then we get to eat it. Okay? So, this is the host of the heavenly. All these beings are the host. Okay? The heavenly host. We also know that within the heavenly host, there's some rebels. We're not talking about them just yet.
Just back up a little bit. It could be, after reading all of Enoch, all of it, and everything.
Yeah?
Just real quick, what was Watcher's first intent? Did they come down out of heaven, cast down out of heaven, and with corruptive thinking, or did they come down out of heaven to watch over mankind and then corrupted themselves?
Somewhere throughout.
Yeah, some of them, this is what we know. All of them at one time were good. They were pure.
Okay.
And then somewhere in the line, there was something happened. That some of them, not all of them, came down and sought to disrupt God's plan. The first time we see it is in we see the Nakash, the shining one, show up in Genesis 3, the serpent, okay?
Right.
But the word is Nakash. It's the idea of a shining one. It might be more than just a snake, okay? He shows up there, and that's the first instance we have of disregarding God or rebelling against God's authority and His standard. The second one is Genesis 6. They come down and they disrupt stuff that went on. And again, 2 Peter 2:4 highlights some of that, and we'll get there. But when we get to Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, this idea of sons of God, it appears again. Very, very specific. It appears in Job 1, verse 6, Job 2, verse 1, Job 38, verse 7. Well, this is what we know. Remember going way back here? We put our line. The sons of God shouted for joy when God laid the foundation of the earth. Same group. But what we know, so that means they were pure at that time. Later, some of them rebelled. And when we get into some of that, I think that Satan had a hand in trafficking.
I guess my question was, weren't the Watchers, somehow
God's command to help us. And we see the angels, for example, in 2 Kings 6, remember Elisha with his servant. He's all worried, we're going to get nailed. And he says, Lord, open his eyes, let him see. His eyes are open, and he sees the whole mountain filled with some sort of beings, these protector beings that are there.
There's in the part, the teacher part of it, the aspect where you have a young child of the king or the prince that is under the direct supervision of what you could term a watcher. I think that language is used in the New Testament as that.
A guardian, like a tutor or
he
something?
brings up in the way he should be, and he has complete authority over that person.
Mm-hmm. That's New Testament language.
Yeah.
But again, I'm not disagreeing. When we get there, we have the Old Testament here, and then we'll have the New Testament over here, and then we're going to try to add some of the New Testament imagery as well onto this pattern, to see how they all come together. Because they're not contradictory. Again, the New Testament just is a little broader, and it takes a little bit more work. But we do see. Let me give you another example. Well, we'll get there. Because
I want to jump to the homework. I'm not.
Okay. So, heavenly host, right? I mean, you see these words. Psalm 78. Man ate the food of the mighty ones. He sent them more than enough to eat. Psalm 103. Bless the Lord, O you his melachim. See, your version, my version will say angels. We get stuck there. But it's just the word, bless the Lord, O you his messengers. You mighty ones who do his word, obeying the voice of his word. Those are the good ones. Praise him, all his melachim. Praise him, all his hosts. Here's Yahweh sitting enthroned, and the writer's saying, God is standing, and he's always in the midst of these Elohim. This isn't anything new. When we get to Psalm 82, it's going to be like, duh, we've seen this over and over and over. God is standing, he's sitting in the midst of his divine council, in the midst of his holy ones. And what the writers say over and over, and we've seen this before, right? He is the Elohim of Elohim. You know, that's just... So when you see these, he's talking about these supernatural beings, and he's going, hey, you Elohim, you need to worship Yahweh. He's the God of gods. You know, no one's like him. Who can compare amongst all these beings? You guys down here, you need to worship him. You need to serve him. You need to praise him. Praise him, all you hosts. Okay. Number 5 there, mediator. Here's the nuance. It's connected with angel. I put there an interesting New Testament parallel is the idea that angels mediated the giving of the law to Moses, and it says it 3 times. Where did we find that in the Old Testament?
New Testament.
No, in the New Testament it says angels gave Moses the law. The only place you see that is Deuteronomy 33 if you read it in the Greek Septuagint version. You don't see that anywhere else.
Well, that ain't happened for me.
LXX, right? What does LXX mean?
70.
70. It's 70 scholars. That number 70 is just, it's everywhere. But we have New Testament proof that the law was given through the mediation of angels. But we don't really find that specifically in the Hebrew Old Testament. So these writers, let's see, whether it was Luke, the writer to the Hebrews, which we don't know who it is, or Paul writing Galatians, where did he get that information? He's reading Deuteronomy 33 in the Septuagint. That's where he's getting it. Okay? Job 33, if there is an angel as a mediator, he goes on. Okay. Number 6, cherubim and seraphim. Okay, we talked a little bit about this last time, that this is a function. What we know, I left it up here, cherubim, seraphim, just means that's plural, okay? But they are represented in the Bible as being protectors or guardians. That's their function. Now, what we don't know is what else. We don't really know their status. We don't know their hierarchy. Well, why did we put them there? We put them there because this little box here is kind of around God's direct throne, and we see them standing around to protect, as if God needs protecting. I don't think that's the case. But God doesn't need anything, but he still chooses to have it, right? So God has chosen to have these beings there. Now, why did we get this imagery of a cherub and seraph? And going back over here, it's erased now. As I mentioned, all of ancient Near Eastern literature has El up there on top, maybe Ra on top, the Egyptian, Aten, all the different phrases for the Egyptian sun god. And they have these beings protecting the throne. God says, well, you know where that comes from. Your false thinking comes from the reality here. I've had this from the beginning, but as the years go, as these fallen beings, fallen Elohim come down and influence mankind and teach them a lot of false theology, all these false theologies mimic, nothing's new under the sun, right? Is Satan creative? He's not creative at all. He just copies. You have the satanic trinity, right? Of the dragon, the beast, and you have the 2 beasts of Revelation 13, and then in Revelation 12 you have the dragon. The dragon with the Antichrist and the false prophet. Well, that seems awfully coincidental. that God has the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit who gives witness to both the Son and the Father. And according to Revelation 12, you have the false prophet, which his only goal is to bring witness to the Antichrist and the dragon. Can't you come up with something new? But remember, Satan has always wanted worship. Worship. We also see, which I should have put that on here, the stars. Okay? We saw back here, sons of God and the morning stars sang together. Is that, it's the genre is wisdom literature? Is it parallel? If it is, Job 38 verse 7, then the sons of God equal the morning stars, which I think that's what it means, based on the genre. Well, later in the book of Isaiah, that being, the Lucifer, the son of the morning, another son of the morning, is, God says, he quotes him. And what that being says is, I am going to make my throne above the stars of God. So these guys, remember, the watchers are making decrees. Now all of a sudden the stars of God, according to Isaiah 14, we're going to get to that more in detail later, they somehow have thrones. And Lucifer, wherever he is on this, he says, I'm going to make mine above those guys. And I'm going to be like the Most High. He doesn't say he is going to be the Most High. He says he's going to be like. He wants to bypass all these, according to him, all these lower class guys. He wants to go above and he wants to say, me and Yahweh are sitting together. That was what was in his heart. He's always desired worship. The only thing that gets worshipped in all of existence is what? Yahweh.
Yahweh.
That's super important. In Revelation 12 and 13, the dragon and the false prophet, they get the whole world to worship the dragon. That's what he's always wanted, is worship. What did he say to Jesus? Yeah, I got all these kingdoms. Oh, look at all these kingdoms and all these nations. I'll give them to you free of charge. Free of charge. All you got to do is worship me. That was Jesus. Come on, just bow to me. I'll give you all. You don't have to go through the cross. I'll give you all the nations. Skip all that. I know that you know you're going to get the nations one day. Psalm 2 says that. That's Old Testament, Psalm 2. But you can skip the hard part. Satan offers a shortcut. All you got to do is worship me.
But that's not the plan.
That's not the plan. Thank the Lord he didn't do it. Okay? So, cherubim, seraphim, stars of God. We will continue, because we got to wrap it up. I don't think we'll make it through the rest of these. Will we? No, we got. Okay. But next time, I've talked about the hierarchy, the status. We've been addressing it a little bit. You see number 3 there. You can look at the various things. Angel of the Lord, Gabriel, sons of God, servants, demons. We're going to get into some of the other negative aspects. Let me say something before we wrap it up. Okay? I cannot, pardon my pedantic, okay, being obsessed with words. In the Old Testament, it's really, really rare to have this idea of demons. We see it in English, okay? And the English comes from, okay, I'm going to go like this, New Testament, Old Testament, okay? The word demon, there's 2 Greek words, I won't list them out for you, but basically it comes from the Greek word daimonion, all right? What happens is we come into the New Testament and we have this exposure to these unclean spirits, which the New Testament calls demons. Then what we do is we take this English word and we were interpreting the Old Testament. We go, well, we don't have any other word because this is now, like for example, I'll give you one, is the word shade, okay? You'll see it on the notes. This is a Hebrew word. We don't know what a shade is. There is some connection with, this actually is a word from Akkadian. it's brought over into the, in Deuteronomy 32 and other places, it's brought over into the Hebrew, but it's an Akkadian word. There's loan words, we have loan words, in ours. But when the translator's looking at this, they go, well, some versions will just say shade. And you go, well, how does that help me? I don't know what a shade is, because in English, did we talk about shade? Not really. So what they do is they go, well, the best thing we can do is throw that word on there. And then what you just did, and I just did, is we went, oh, we know what a demon is based on the New Testament. You see what we just did? Don't do that.
Don't do that.
Because when people, they see, oh, when they're developing their theology of demons, they read the New Testament, and then they get out a concordance, and they find this word appearing in the Old Testament. It's a Hebrew word, and then they take that imagery and say, see, demons is here. And you go, that's not the word. What you just did is took this and forced it back on here. Because, and I'm not trying to be arrogant, what I mean is, because they're only looking at it in English. And we cannot do that. There is this line where this being is the way it's presented in the Hebrew Bible is different than the way demons are. Because you want to know, in classical Greek, they had this word, and now I'll write it up. Daimonion. These two words, you know what its parallel is? Elohim.
Really?
All it means, yeah. In classical Greek, the word daimonion is just simply a spiritual being, which could be a good one. But see, but in the New Testament, there's only one instance, and it's in Acts 17, where the word daimonion is neutral. All the rest of the New Testament instances are negative. So if you think, oh, I know what demons are, they're bad. That's not accurate. Because, again, in classical Greek, this is what it means. It just means spiritual being. And oftentimes, it was reference to other deities. But if we take the negativity and bring it back on the Old Testament, now see what we're doing is we're going from Greek to English, back over to English, back to Hebrew. That is not the way. Let Hebrew speak for itself. And don't force it. Bob?
I can't recall demonic possession in the Old Testament.
Correct. That's a New Testament idea. What's fascinating to me is in the New Testament, these beings, these demons, we're going to talk about them.
Evil spirits.
These evil spirits, demons. In the New Testament, the word, but they're also called unclean spirit, which is the word pneuma. We'll get there. Okay? We haven't done any of the New Testament yet. They always seek to be embodied. These beings do. Well, in the Old Testament, I don't see an Elohim ever seeking to be embodied. That tells me there's a distinction.
I thought the definition of shade was disembodied spirit.
All they know, they don't. It's what they know is it is a disembodied. Well, that's what Elohim means, right? Elohim just means a spiritual being.
Well, what about Nephilim then, if you go back to that?
We'll get there. I'm sorry. Next week. But what I'm saying is that in the Old Testament, you don't see Elohim trying to possess anything. That's something that comes in the New Testament. Here, this is the word that they'll use for shade. They'll say, well, from the Akkadian, which is Akkadian, when you get in there, there's more instances so you can kind of see the context. These are all territorial spirits. Well, that's interesting.
Didn't Saul get, an evil spirit enter him? Didn't they say that in the Old Testament?
Yeah, but it's not the word demon.
It isn't?
It's the word ruach. It just means spirit. Same thing in the Greek. So, shade is very, very clear. And again, we haven't got there yet, but I'm trying to introduce, it's a territorial entity that has a very defined geographic zip code. Okay,
Well,
you see
so
that?
the spirit of Saul, it doesn't necessarily mean a being. It could be like a attitude or something along those lines.
Well, I think in some of them yes, and some of them no, because it talks about God sending it. You see that several times, maybe not specifically with Saul, but God sent a spirit to trouble somebody. Now, it could be I guess it could be an attitude. God sent a troubling attitude or a troubled frame of mind. But it seems to be that, it seems to be a little bigger than that. But
A chemical imbalance.
chemical imbalance, according to modern, right?
I can't measure chemicals.
If you look on, even if we don't, number 1 on page 4, that was a spirit. Okay? That was not a troubled thought. In nature, number 1, 1 Kings 22, a spirit stepped forward. God sent a spirit to stir up hostility between the leaders of Shechem. That's where it's clear that, even though I agree with what Bill's saying, that it could be maybe just a troubled idea or troubled maybe depression. But here, 1 Kings 22, it's very clear that the word ruach is a spirit that steps forward. Now, it is a being there, and potentially in other places too. So we'll get to the rest of the hierarchy next time. But I find it fascinating because we're going to continue to populate this, especially when we get to the New Testament, to see how it looks. So when Ephesians 6:12 says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, spiritual hosts of darkness, rulers of this age. We haven't even put them on here yet because that's on the New Testament. Where do they fit? But this is telling us this is the battle zone. Yeah.
Okay, I've always been fascinated with that description about the spirit going to deceive, which lends credence to an idea that deception is not necessarily a sin.
If you want an article, there's an article that just came by. It asked that exact question: is deception a sin? And deception is what God was doing. You got time for one example? Yeah, I'll give you one example. And I've wrestled this even before I saw this article. And I thought, because it's touchy. Remember when Saul was going crazy? Okay, King Saul was going crazy. He's out trying to kill David, or he's just going wacko. And he's got off the deep end. He's disobeyed, and so God tells Samuel, "I want you to go to Bethlehem because I'm going to anoint the next king." Samuel was, "Hey, Saul's kind of wacko right now. He might kill me." God says, if he asks you, tell him that you're going to offer a sacrifice.
Interesting.
So he lies to.
Not necessarily.
Maybe he's doing both.
It wasn't the full truth. It still was true. Hey, you are going to offer sacrifice, but you don't owe Saul an answer. Therefore, God says, I don't owe you anything, Saul. I'm going to give you this one truth. Where you take it, it's up to you. Okay, now, I tell my daughter all the time, you're leading me to believe something.
Lies
now,
of omission.
But
That's
it's
omission.
omission. But God is still righteous. And so they use this lying spirit as well as that passage, and they try to wrestle with, hey, how God's really towing the line here by not providing the full truth. Or if you look at Rahab, right? She lies and says they aren't here, and God blesses her socks off. Okay, that's great. So, but anyways, I find it fascinating. That it's a very good question.
David told Jonathan to lie when he says, "Tell him I'm visiting my relatives."
Right.
I'm hiding in a rock, but tell him anyway.
God didn't do a full lie at all. He just gave one truth as opposed to the whole truth, nothing but the truth. So help me God, right?
And then he left it up to you to follow.
He left it up to him to go wherever his crazy mind went to.
His mind led him.
So let's pray. Father, we thank you that, again, we get the privilege of learning and growing and getting some precision and understanding your word. You tell us to be diligent, to study, to show ourselves approved why and how, so that we can have your approval rightly, carefully, dividing your word and seeing it in its proper context. So that's the goal. All of us are students of the word, and we want to do it well, and we want to do it right. And we just pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.